I'm basically going to tell you a few stories of my experience working in cultural diplomacy. But I'd like to start with a few general remarks because, after all, I think we don't want just to go home with some stories, but we want to have a new perspective, a new understanding of the importance of cultural relations and perhaps guidance for how we might do it better in the future. So the main points that I want to make, and you will see how these are illustrated by the stories, is that those of us who care about soft power or cultural diplomacy, we need to know ourselves and know the other person. This is not just a Chinese concept, 知己知彼, but it is a basic element of any kind of cultural exchange or understanding. So if we don't know what our own culture is, and we don't know who we're talking to, we will never be able to communicate effectively. If we don't know what our target audience's culture is, then how can we advise them or engage in introducing it to our own culture? So that's the first point. The second point is that I'm looking back over the history of our engagement with China. I'm not going back to centuries ago. I'm not going back to the Gold Rush period. And I'm starting in 1972. And very much I'm drawing on a chapter which I wrote in this book called Reorienting Australia-China Relations, that was put together to mark 30 years of our relations with China. Now, of course, more than 10 years have gone past since then, so when I was preparing for this talk, I reread what I'd written there, and basically, nothing much has changed. I still agree with what I said in this chapter. I'm sure this is in your library, which should be, and if you want to know a bit more than I can tell you this afternoon, look for that chapter which is about our cultural relations. And what it says is that in the 1970s, when it all began, on both sides, our cultural exchanges were very much government to government. It was a government policy, and it was conducted by civil servants, government, public servants, and while no doubt it had some effect at that level, but it didn't really reach the people, and it wasn't initiated by the people, it was initiated by the governments. Now, how come it's still going on? Because what we see over 30, 40 years is that our relations have become more complex and more multi-layered. And I'm struck by one point I make in this chapter, which was that ACIAC, which is associated with the University of Melbourne, in the year 2001 held a forum to discuss our cultural exchanges with Asia. And they identified one important principle, which is that artists and writers and people who work in the cultural field, they don't feel, that they are just nationalistic Australians or nationalistic Chinese. They are more interested in absorbing influences, in understanding other people's culture. And that if we really want to promote cultural diplomacy, cultural exchanges, we should be starting with the artists, writers, and cultural practitioners, and let them cooperate, and let them build something new, and an atmosphere of trust. And that was what the ACIAC Forum said in 2001, and I think it's a very valid point. It's not just limited to that particular occasion. So having said all that, let me give you a few stories. And I'm going to start with Beatles. Because at the beginning of our relationship with China, what I found was that the scientists had got there first, and that it was much easier to organize some exchanges with the Chinese Academy of Sciences and with the scientists in various universities, and to build on exchanges, correspondence, and cooperation that was already there. And this is still very true. If our science is going to get anywhere in the future, in areas such as, James knows we looked about radio astronomy just last week, then we must build a continuing exchange relationship with scientists in China who are now doing some cutting edge, really advanced scientific work, and have possibly a lot more money supporting their efforts than our struggling universities are. But what about the dung beetles? Well, if you've been travelling in the country in Australia, you may know the Australian salute to get rid of the flies. Now, how come there are so many flies in Australia? It's because we have a lot of sheep and cattle. And they were brought in from Europe. The dung beetle, which exists in every country in the world, is evolved to deal with the dung from various animals. Australian native dung beetles were very good at collecting the dung from kangaroos and wombats, but they could not digest these great big cowpats. So the CSIRO Division of Entomology had a brilliant plan to collect dung beetles in China that were used to dealing with water buffalo dung. And in 1973, through the Academy of Sciences, in that summer vacation, they organized school children from every school, well, a lot of schools up and down the Yangtze River Valley, possibly Professor Wong was involved in it, going out and collecting dung beetles. My role was very simple. Every day, boxes of dung beetles arrived in my office, so there was hardly room for me. And then I had to put them on an Air Pakistan flight to Tokyo, and from Tokyo they were transferred to a flight to Singapore, and from Singapore they went to Christmas Island, and there they were 18 months in quarantine, and eventually they were imported into Australia. And these days, there are far fewer flies in Australia. Thank you, China. Our national interest. Now let me give you one more story from the next year, 1974. The system was that we had a long list of things that we thought China would like, and I presented it to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because there wasn't a Ministry of Culture in that year. And they looked at the list, and they chose something in music, and something in art, and so on and so forth. And in the music slot, they said, yes, we'll all have this, and I'd given them a copy of this record. The Rosny Children's Choir from Hobart in Tasmania, singing a program. The first half was going to be The Sound of Music, and the second half was some Australian folk songs, like Waltzing Matilda. The Rosny Children's Choir had never travelled anywhere outside Australia before, and we couldn't understand why the Chinese might choose this instead of the Sydney Symphony Orchestra or something more famous. It was only many years later when I happened to read a biography of a lady who was called the Tsar of Culture in China, Jiang Qing, that I discovered that her favorite music was, guess what? The Sound of Music. And that is why at every performance, and they were really treated like royalty in China, the first 3 rows were left empty in case Madame Jiangqing and her friends might like to come and hear them sing. So, that was a very political, I mean, I didn't realize at the time. I thought I didn't object, I didn't like it very much because I thought Sound of Music was not Australian, you know? What was it going to showcase Australian music when we were singing an American, well, it's not American, it's an American production, but the story is actually about Europe. However, you live and learn. So let's move on to something a little bit more productive. Everybody who went to China in the 1970s used to be taken to see the acrobatics. They certainly were technically brilliant. And Australia had nothing, no people of that standard. So in 1982, by that time I'd already left China, and this was time when I was working as the director of the Australia-China Council. The Australia-China Council sponsored a visit by the Nanjing acrobatic troupe. They were a lovely group of people. And that led to a very fruitful development, and I use the word fruit advisedly, which is a group called the Flying Fruit Fly Circus. See, the entomologists got back in the picture again. The Flying Fruit Fly Circus is based in Albury, on the border between New South Wales and Victoria. And they are an acrobatic school. So if you're going to be an acrobat, you have to start training when you're young and supple. And they really have developed as a result of that initial visit from the Nanjing acrobatic troupe. So they've had Chinese acrobatic trainers working with them all along, and they've now developed to a level where they tour nationally and even internationally, and they've done a great deal for the regional economy of Albury-Wodonga. So we're very grateful to, I think, our colleague Carrillo Gantner, who was then the cultural councillor in Beijing and initiated this exchange. It's worthwhile remembering. And it shows how something that maybe started as a government initiative can develop its own momentum and continue as on a collaborative basis. Well, over the years in the 1970s and 80s, as I say, we start with top-down, with the state, with government exchanges, and they develop into something which is multi-layered and develop its own. But the state is still involved. And if we look at the sort of acme of soft power activities, we probably should look at the Olympic Games, because Olympic Games really do more than anything else to develop a country's soft power. That's if they work properly, if they're not disastrously mismanaged. And the Sydney Olympics in the year 2000 were regarded as highly successful in establishing Australia's prestige status in the soft power stakes. But I think that anybody who actually attended those Olympics would tell you it wasn't so much the fireworks, it wasn't so much the opening ceremony, it was the whole atmosphere, and particularly the role of the volunteers who were there to welcome, to direct people, to advise people. And likewise, in the case of the Beijing Olympics in the year 2008, China knew that this volunteer program had been very successful in Sydney, so they also had volunteers. But I think because people were more traveling there in groups rather than as individual participants in the audience. They didn't get so much contact with those volunteers. And they took away more an impression that, that China had an enormous power to conscript the army to carry out functions. Look at these soldiers, all of exactly the same height, all so drilled, This is not the image that China really should be projecting to the world. It doesn't give you a feeling of that sort of warm, fuzzy friendliness. So I'm sorry, Zhang Yimou, who designed the but I don't think that you really excelled yourself in this respect. Oops. Let me just finish with one final example of how cultural exchanges can develop. Australia has benefited very greatly from the number of writers and artists who have moved from China to Australia and are now part of our regular artistic scene. One of them, I've just chosen one, is Guan Wei, and here is a work of his called Spellbound, which was actually created, he did similar work in Sydney, but I couldn't find an example of the mural that he did at Powerhouse Museum. This is from Shenzhen, an exhibition there. And if you look at this, he's got a really interesting subject matter because he's taken the idea, what if Admiral Zheng He had come south and discovered Australia? And there are monsters in the sea because in old maps they always drew maps of remote parts of the world that were inhabited by monsters. But if you look in the top left-hand corner, you can see some kangaroos, so you know it must be Australia, because there's no other country that has kangaroos. And there are some Aboriginal people having a corroboree. So his work has done a lot to help to create an understanding of, how this is a manufactured history. It's not real history. It's fake news, you might say, but it does create a kind of fellow feeling. It helps to build a bridge between our two cultures, and that's what our work is all about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. Actually, we have time for some questions. Anyone want to ask a question? Or ask her to tell another story?
Hi, Jocelyn. That's very informative. The story you remember, Rossini Choir, I was there, 1974. I didn't realize that's Australian choir. Because I was in Central Conservatory. Okay, so I have said it's really interesting what we have on memory. And also, global diplomacy, soft power. We learn from this group is go clean the ship, Chey. So that's why every musician comes here to perform the music called Chey. So I thank you, as you know that, and that is story for 1974. Thanks.
I think that's a comment, and I didn't catch if there was a question, so I just a comment.
I just thanks for your remembrance.
Thank you.
Would you like to explain that?
There's as you were saying, talking about soft power. If it becomes too much propaganda, then it's not effective. It has the reverse effect. The Chamber Music Festival, which has been taking place every year for the last, I think, 6 years in the Chinese Garden in central Sydney, is organized Well, it was started by a friend of mine who's an Australian composer called John Huey. That's not a Chinese surname, it's H-U-I-E. And he, it's hard to make a living as a musician, so he went to Hong Kong and then Shanghai and developed a role as a composer of music in advertising and for films. And in that process, he got to know a lot of Chinese musicians. So after he came back to Sydney, he had this idea that the Chinese garden in Chinatown would be a beautiful venue for an outdoor musical event. And each year he has invited the Chinese Chinese Cultural Centre is now involved with this backsit, and they bring some musicians from China, and some of the music is traditional Western or Chinese, but some of it is written specially for that occasion and includes both local musicians and visiting musicians. So I think this is another very good example of an effective and continuing cultural engagement, which is building a deep trust and an ongoing friendship between both countries. I think I've forgotten about that slide, and I don't think we're anymore.
Thank you, Jocelyn, for the interesting presentation. My question today is I personally noticed lots of culture exchange been developed in the past few years. Another example is the Culture by the Sea exhibition. I noticed this year at least, some artists present their work there. So this is one example only, but I noticed in other fields there is lots of activity going on. So my question is, do you think some of them is government, would either be personal initiative? Is this a very deliberate cultural diplomacy that China is going to apply, or I'm just trying to understand whether this is government initiative behind?
What's the first place that you said that you noticed?
Sculpture by the Sea. Sculpture by the Sea.
Sculpture by the Sea, yeah, yes. I think Sculpture by the Sea, because it's featured a number of Chinese sculptors, and it's a very popular event, so that's a very effective, very effective. Now, I'm not quite sure how that works. I know there is an organisation behind Sculpture by the Sea, but I don't know to what extent there is Chinese government support for it. So I can't really comment. I will make one other comment, though, about Chinese government-directed cultural initiatives in Australia. I think they could be much improved, and I think that the Chinese, let's just say the consulate or the embassy, they rely too much on the feedback they get from the Chinese language media rather than the standard English language media. So if something is put on and it appeals to Chinese Australian audience, it gets a big write-up in the Chinese language media and it gets fed back as being a success. But a lot of those events don't appeal to other people. They only appeal to Chinese Australians. I have been to performances in the Opera House where the entire audience is Chinese Australians. And maybe 2 or 3, myself included, other people. So that, even if it's regarded as successful in the Chinese language media, that doesn't translate into a big contribution to China's soft power.
you.